Good evening. I'm so glad that you are here, and I want to say a word about here. We stand on the homelands of the Wahpekute band and other bands of the Dakota Nation. We honor with gratitude the people who have stewarded the land throughout the generations and their ongoing contributions to this region. We acknowledge the ongoing injustices that we have committed against the Dakota Nation, and we wish to interrupt this legacy, beginning with acts of healing and honest storytelling and history telling about this place. That is the land acknowledgement agreement of the city of Northfield, St. Olaf, and Carleton College. I want to thank you for being brave enough to listen to this presentation about the invisible racism we hold toward Indigenous people. And I want you to remember as we go along that this is not going to be easy. There are going to be some hard things to hear, but important for you to remember your own goodness. That is true of you. And also to remember and realize that when we have collective witnessing and presencing of something that we have not had in the past, that begins the healing of that. And we can become, and you can become the remedy to heal this legacy. You may have ideas about some actions that you can take in that direction as we go, and I hope you will. I'm Dorothea Hrossowyc, and I'm a member of the Northfield Community's Beyond the Land Acknowledgement Committee, and I'm also on the Land Acknowledgement Committee for the First United Church of Christ here in Northfield. I have an adopted Dakota daughter, adopted in the Dakota way, who is Graci Horne. And she had originally agreed to do this presentation a while back. And this is one that she did for the Minneapolis Institute of Art. But she told me recently she didn't want to do it. She said she is tired of educating white people about racism and the painful process that is. And she said, white people should do it. So you do it, she said to me. I totally understand what she meant. So you just get me tonight, but she did give me her presentation that she made for the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and I'll be sharing that with you, and also some that I have added about history in our area. The first thing I want to say is that Indigenous people in our country have been invisible for 500 years. We didn't want to see them because we wanted to take their land. So we moved them farther and farther west as the country got larger. This happened all over the country over the last 500 to 600 years, but it's important to know that here in Northfield, it happened relatively recently. Northfield was formed in the mid-1850s, and that was the time of the forced removal, the ethnic cleansing, and the genocide that happened here. And as many of you are learning, this is not something we've been taught in our history books or that our children have been taught. So it's a major piece of the invisibility of racism toward Indigenous people that we don't know this history until recently. Now there is a law in Minnesota that says that schools must teach the history of Indigenous peoples. And there's a proposal that hasn't passed yet that Todd Lippert was really supporting, but it hasn't gone through, that says that educators need to be educated about this history themselves so that they can teach it. They haven't been able to learn it either. It wasn't in their history books. So as time went on in the history of the US, Indigenous people were expected to assimilate into white society, to become white. That was the purpose, for example, of the boarding schools, to make Indigenous children white. Quote, remove the Indian to save the man, unquote. I'll talk more about that later. The people were to be moved westward, where they were put on small reservations where there was little way to make a living. And that is so often still true today, but we know little about that. That is also largely invisible. Many reservations in South Dakota of the Dakota Lakota people from here who were moved away live on the poorest reservations in the country. Another piece of invisible racism. There's no way to make a living. It's very, very hard. where the reservations are, to find a way to make a living. I have 8 nieces and nephews that are Iroquois, raised in Massachusetts, where I was born and lived but they have been totally assimilated. They know they have that heritage, but they know nothing about from where precisely their people are from, and knew nothing about that culture. I actually accidentally discovered that they had to be from the Ganawage Reserve outside of Montreal, Canada, because the State United Church of Christ Conference asked me about 25 years ago, to drive a group of Lakota elders from South Dakota to a meeting, an important meeting being held on the Ganawage Reserve outside Montreal. When I saw the people there, I recognized how much they looked like my brother-in-law. It's like I saw him walking down the road, and how much they looked like my nieces and nephews. My nieces and nephews never knew anything about that beautiful Iroquois culture. It was completely invisible in Massachusetts, and that is terribly sad, but we thought assimilation was normal. It's also important to know that there were laws in the US and in some states until relatively recently that said, if anyone had any drop of African American heritage in their ancestry, they had to claim being African American. Louisiana was the last state to get rid of that law. And it was in my lifetime as an adult, I remember reading about it in the Star Tribune. Not that people paid serious attention to it then, but the law was still on the books. And that's because we wanted more slaves. So more people had to claim being African American back in the day. But if you were Indigenous, you had to prove it. You had to have, in most states, at least 3/5 in Indigenous heritage to be able to claim it at all. These days, you still have to have a certain percentage to claim being Indigenous, although in some states the amount has changed, but it's still there. Very odd that you have to prove that heritage. And so you could even be of mixed heritage and not be able to claim your Indigenous heritage officially. But I want to talk first about the Doctrine of Discovery. So I am going to bring up the PowerPoint. Hold on. Okay, so I'm sure you have seen this picture before, or pictures like this in your history books. And the Doctrine of Discovery is based on 3 papal bulls of 1452, 1455, and 1493. And this is, I think, really important for Christians to know about this, because it's, again, not something that's in our history. And if you're listening and you're Christian, because this is largely hidden in your history, it's important to know about this. It was back in the time when all Christians were under the popes, before the Protestant Reformation. And these papal bulls were issued by 2 corrupt popes, one of whom had 2 wives back in the day when priests could be married. And these 2 wanted wealth. So in exchange for money from other countries, this Doctrine of Discovery gave Portugal permission to enslave Africa, and gave Spain and Holland and England permission to, quote, discover, unquote, lands. And if the people living there refused to become Christian, they could remove them, take the resources in the land. So this Doctrine of Discovery promoted the subjugation, exploitation, enslavement, forced assimilation, and genocide, spreading Christianity by means of the sword. And if you look at this picture, you see the cross, and you can see the swords, and you can see how the people are standing, how the white people are standing, and how the native people, Indigenous people are standing. Part of the conditioning that we got. So I'm so glad that so much more information is now coming out about this. Maybe you saw the movie the UCC Church and Carleton College showed about this a few years ago when we helped raise money to send a group of Indigenous teenagers from St. Paul to Rome to ask Pope Francis to rescind this doctrine. It's still in existence. I believe it's very important for Christians to know this heritage and to deal with it, but not only Christians, because important to know that here in the United States, the doctrine of discovery has policies and laws grounded in it in the United States, and it has been used to justify the genocide of many millions of indigenous tribes, the destruction of their cultures and languages, the theft of their lands, and the denial of their sovereignty. Scholars tell us that at least 20 million people were Holocausted in Mexico. We do need to remember the 6 million Jews who were Holocausted. And what about the 20 million Mexican indigenous people? And we don't know how many millions in the US. Some scholars guess about 13 million. Some say a lot more. So let's not leave that invisible, that happened here. In 1823, the Doctrine of Discovery was adopted into US law by the US Supreme Court when Chief Justice John Marshall based the US Constitution on the doctrine because he needed precedent for the he needed legal precedent for the US Constitution, observing that Christian European nations had, quote, assumed ultimate dominion over the lands of America during the Age of Discovery, unquote, and that upon discovery, quote, the Indians had lost their rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations and only retained a right of occupancy in their lands, unquote. That is still in effect today. Tribes can have occupancy, but the federal government holds the land in trust. In 1864, after the US Dakota War here, this is hard, US Senator James Harlan on the US Senate floor declared that anyone who refused to merge into and become part of the superior race must be destroyed. It is a law of humanity. And then Senator Doolittle, then chair of the Committee on Indian Affairs, quote, God in his providence gave this continent to millions of a higher civilization, unquote. The doctrine was cited in many Supreme Court cases throughout the years as precedent, even as recently as 2014, including a precedent by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 2005, against a case against the United Indians in New York. Again, a lot of invisible racism toward indigenous people. And here is a clip of a well-known leader, Lakota leader, Floyd Westerman, and what he has to say. And he says, I would like to quote a very prejudicial doctrine that was handed down by the Supreme Court in 1823. It said that the Indian nations do not have title to their lands because they weren't Christians. That is that the first Christian nation to discover an area of heathen lands has the absolute title. This doctrine should be withdrawn and renounced to establish a new basis for a relationship between indigenous peoples and other peoples of the world. And I want to show you this shot. These are the teenagers that went to Rome to request that Pope Francis rescind the doctrine. We can't all go to Rome, but we did support these teenagers. And here's their teacher, Mitch Walking Elk. He's a ceremonial music teacher, and he had taught them about the Doctrine of Discovery. And they said, we have to do something about that. So some people here in Northfield and a lot of people in the Twin Cities raised money to support them to go. Many of them had never been on an airplane before, so it was a really exciting trip for them. But of course, they didn't get to meet with Pope Francis, but they met with the bishops, and the bishops said, oh, we don't pay any attention to that. And the teenagers said, oh, but how about looking at this in the United States, and this, and this. And that surprised the bishops. And so then they said, well, it's going to be a process. It's going to take some time. So we started a letter writing campaign. And if you want to write a letter to the Vatican, it costs $1.15, and we tell you what you can say. You can write your own, and you can use the one we have and send it to ask that they continue this process that they promised. Okay. How many of you have, one more, I'm going to say one more thing before we go to Gracie's talk. How many of you have heard the name, the real name, the original name of the river here in Northfield? The Wahpekute people called it Ian Bosendada, which means standing rock river or standing stone river. And it was named after their sacred site just north of here, which the Europeans called Castle Rock. The Wahpekute were canoe people, and they traded with the French-Canadian fur traders. So the French called it the River of Canoes. Then the explorer Zebulon Pike showed up, and he mistranslated the French word for canoe into cannon. So now our river is named after a war machine. So what would you like your river named after? A sacred site in nature, the River of Canoes, or a war machine? And I'm wondering how many of you have ever seen Inyan Bosendada, what we call now Castle Rock. You can see here how high it was a long time ago. I remember when you could see it from the roads far away. Now it has crumbled, the top has fallen off. But the worst part is, I want to show you this. Here's what it looks like now. That's Inyan Bosendada now. But the worst part is it's very defaced. It's written on, painted on, carved on, bottles and trash left around. And how many of us ever knew it was actually a sacred site where ceremonies were held, where people went to pray out in nature, a spiritual place? Another sign of the invisibility of racism toward Indigenous people, that their sacred sites are ignored and defaced without consequence. And that happens in a lot of places in Minnesota. And there are organizations now in the cities that are trying to do something about that. That's another place, another thing you can support if you're interested. Okay, now we go to Gracie's talk. Historical and personal overview of systemic racism in the arts. Graci Horne, multidisciplinary artist, Sisseton Wahpeton, Wahpekute, Hunkpapa. Notice she is of Wahpekute descent also. And she starts with a quote from Joanne Jones Rizzi, the Vice President of Science, Equity, and Education at the Science Museum of Minnesota, who says, "When is it not whiteness? White supremacy culture is the norm. It represents the prevailing way of thinking and is normalized in our everyday interactions and museum culture. White supremacy culture is dominant in thinking, speaking, dressing, behaving, meeting styles, language, and communication. For those who challenge this norm, it takes courage, confidence, frustration, or fury. I tend to overthink it, weighing reactions, impact to others, to myself. What will it mean? Who will it hurt? Who will be angry? Who won't understand? How much will it cost me? My overwrought hand-wringing is symptomatic of the insidiousness of white supremacy culture and how it works its way into our psyche and erodes our self-esteem, our self-worth, and self-confidence. Survival is real. We all have our own levels of tolerance and abilities to show up each day to work within a culture that negates brown, Black, and Indigenous people and renders us invisible." And now Gracie suggests, let's look to the past. Sacred objects were frequently sent to museums in Europe, and the Smithsonian also has many. Notice here, this is me now. Notice here in this photograph that Gracie sends, here's a peace pipe. That is a very sacred object. most of these clothings here and shawls were ceremonial pieces. Much of what's here were ceremonial pieces, and they were just sent to museums all over the place. And Gracie writes, Native audiences conditioning to accept disconnection to sacred objects and sovereignty over their historical narratives. Many items found in museums are misinformed. Items were written speculatively by white cis males. And then she brings this up and suggests that we really notice this picture, really realize this picture here. Just keep it in your mind for a little bit. According to research by Samuel Myers Jr., director of the Roy Wilkins Center for Human Relations and Social Justice at the University of Minnesota, Myers has been documenting the Minnesota paradox for years. 2/3 of white students meet reading proficiency in school testing, while only 1/3 of Black students do. Home ownership for whites in Minnesota is near 73%. For Black families, just 26%. We know that occurred due to years of housing discrimination and legal mortgage documents that barred Black families and other Indigenous people from purchasing homes in certain neighborhoods. Myers' research also shows the median household income in Minnesota is $77,000 for whites and $42,000 for Blacks. The median income for Indigenous people is $40,051. In Minnesota, the rate of denial of mortgage applications is the highest by far for Indigenous people. And she writes, my experience of being a Dakota woman is being invisible. I was not raised with knowing about the Dakota War of 1862. Although my family raised me to know Minnesota is our Dakota ancestral homelands, no one acknowledged it. And here she's going to be talking about racism in Minnesota and South Dakota, I should have said. She says, South Dakota's racism was more visible and palpable. Sundowns towns were a real thing for my parents' generation. Sundown towns were towns where no Native people were allowed to live. All white municipalities or neighborhoods, excluding non-whites, by some combination of discrimination, local laws, intimidation, or violence. And I'll add here that we in Minnesota, we know about redlining in certain suburbs to present the selling of homes to non-whites. So it happened here too. And Gracie goes on. Many medicine people were killed in South Dakota by local police forces or army. My father told me a story of a medicine man who was taken from his village and his family in Pine Ridge. He was brought to a field and shot execution style. This was in the 1960s when our way of life was outlawed. For Native people, our traditional practices had to be hidden underground and oftentimes were actually buried in the earth for protection. Until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, did we have protection of the rights of Native Americans to exercise our traditional religions by ensuring access to sites, use and possession of sacred objects, which was illegal before that, and the freedom to worship through ceremonials and traditional rites. And I want to add something here. Medicine people in the Indigenous tradition are spiritual leaders like ministers or priests. Let's just let this sink in. It wasn't until 1978 in the land of freedom of religion that Native people could practice their religion legally, do their spiritual ceremonies, use their sacred objects or their sacred herbs. It was against the law. Imagine that. Not till 1978 in this land of freedom of religion, that was the first time Indigenous people could legally practice their ceremonies, use their plant medicines or their sacred objects. As a result, many practices were lost or forgotten. Songs were lost, sometimes actually buried. I was told once that at one time, there were only 2 medicine people left in all of South Dakota that were in the Lakota tradition. There are few original speakers, although luckily, a lot of people now are learning that language. And also, luckily, a lot of the traditions have been reclaimed, handed down, sometimes reclaimed through elders who remember, sometimes reclaimed through dreams, through prayer and ceremony to remember, through study and research, or digging in the ground to find those records or objects, and also through some amazing ways. And I can tell you about some of them later if you want to hear. Some of you may remember Larry Martin, who lived here in Northfield for many years till he died. His wife still lives here. He was a professor at St. Olaf, also the University of Minnesota Duluth and the University of Wisconsin Superior. He was instrumental in the passing of the Indian Freedom of Religion Act and also in the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, which finally ended the very common practice of taking Indigenous children out of their homes and families and being given to white families, thinking that they would be better off if they were raised by white families. And these were often farm families who needed workers. As a child, Larry was taken from his family and given to a white farm family who needed workers, another huge sign of invisible racism. And Larry, despite all he did, was relatively unseen, I think, here in Northfield. And he was also the subject right here of a severe incident here in Northfield of invisible racism by police. In the middle of the night, a drunk driver crashed into the front of his house, woke him up. He went outside to see what was going on. The driver got out of the car and was running down the street, running away. The police showed up. Somebody called the police, and they immediately thought it must be the drunk Indian. And they put Larry, an elderly man, in handcuffs. His wife came out and argued with the priest and the police and said, "He lives here. This is not our car." And they finally listened after a long time. Another example of invisible racism by police. The picture in this slide, which Gracie really wants us to see, is of Lost Bird and General Leonard Colby. She survived during the Wounded Knee Massacre on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1890. Her mother was shot, and as an infant, she survived days soaked in her mother's blood. She was found by General Colby and illegally adopted. Her life was difficult as she faced racism in her home and sexual abuse. She became pregnant by General Colby and was sent to a prison-like home for pregnant women. Her baby was stillborn. However, she was kept for another year in a reformatory as if it was her fault and her problem. Zinka, which was her real name, returned eventually to her mother in Washington and then married a man who infected her with syphilis. She tried different careers, including working with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which exploited her Native American background. And let me add this, if you know anything about Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, you know how the Native people were exploitively showcased. She tried to work in vaudeville and in the early movie business, dressed as an Indian woman, of course, and reportedly may have had to work as a prostitute as well. Zinka had 2 more children. One died, and she gave the other to an Indian woman that she felt could take better care of him because she and her ailing husband were desperately poor. She fell ill in February 1920 during an influenza epidemic, and on February 14th, Lost Bird died at the age of 29 of the Spanish flu complicated by syphilis. She was buried in a pauper's grave in California. The bright light in Zinka's story is that the only bright light was that her bones were exhumed in 1991. 71 years after her death, by the Wounded Knee Survivors Association, the Wounded Knee Survivors Association, to be returned to the battlefield and buried with great ceremony while news media and hundreds of Native American descendants watched. I hope, this is me now, I hope you understand what a huge piece of invisible racism all of this shows, especially about General Colby. Look at him here. He's shown as a US Army hero and like he's holding a treasure of some kind. And Gracie is talking here about the Wounded Knee Massacre 30 years after the US Dakota War, at a time when the Dakota and the Lakota people were trying to recover themselves and rise back up. They were spending a lot of time in spiritual ceremonies to do this. And the US Army felt threatened and began violent repressions again, remember, because practicing their religion was made illegal. And the people tried to protect themselves, but they knew they couldn't stand up against the US Army, so they agreed to surrender. They were told to march to Wounded Knee, part of the Pine Ridge Reservation. Half were women and children. And in a botched attempt to disarm the Lakota men, over 300 were massacred. So let's just all take that in a little bit. That's hard to know and to hear, I realize, but important also that we realize the history that's happened in the Northern Prairies. Next slide here. Racism in the arts. Gracie writes, telling people of color narratives is white supremacy. This is The Scaffold by Sam Durant. And quote, this is a quote from Sam Durant, who writes, I made Scaffold as a learning space for people like me, white people who have not suffered the effects of a white supremacist society and who may not consciously know it exists, unquote, the artist said in his own statement, where he also went on to say, quote, white artists need to address the issues of white supremacy and that whites created the concept of race. So I want you to, this is me now, I want you to take that in, what he's saying here, and remember this in a little bit later after we listen to what else Gracie has to say about this. Art is a traditional practice on Turtle Island. Being a Dakota artist is a struggle for income and visibility. Many Dakota artists have told the story. Many Dakota artists have told the story of the Dakota 38 hanging of Dakota men and boys on December 26, 1862 in Mankato, Minnesota. There are firsthand stories and accounts of what happened and why, but our history books are written by our colonizers. As a Native artist, we don't receive the attention or opportunities as white artists. The Walker Scaffold was a recent example of racial disparities in the arts. Scaffold was going to be one of the new pieces added to the Walker Minneapolis Sculpture Garden during its multi-million-dollar renovation. Conceived as a commentary on capital punishment by the artist Sam Durant, the sculpture comprises elements of 7 different hangings in US history. But one of these events it was supposedly commemorating, and had wood from Mankato to do that, the execution of the 38 Dakota men following the US Dakota War in 1862 remains a subject of special pain in Minnesota. It was the largest mass execution in US history. The large box-like frame of Scaffold recalls the gallows erected in Mankato, Minnesota for the hangings a century and a half ago. And I want to say something about this. You have probably heard of this maybe a few years ago when this happened at the Walker Art Museum in Minneapolis. You can see the scaffold, here it is. And you see the spoon with the cherry back there. This was the sculpture garden where people go to walk around and play, and children play, and they go to visit. And this is Gracie right here, who helped to organize a huge protest against it, which happened. The Walker paid Sam Durant $450,000 for this scaffold. And Sam Durant had traveled all over Europe with it already, first making piles of money showing it there. Neither Sam nor the Walker ever asked any Dakota people about it. They were never told it was going up. They weren't asked what they thought about it until it was already up, to their great shock and surprise. And even then they weren't asked. They just had to see it. So I want to show you some other photos of the protests that happened there, which I think are really good to see. Here it is. There's the scaffold. Here's the sculpture garden. You see that? The spoon. This is when it was going up. It almost looks like a climbing structure, right? For children to play on. But here are some of the signs of the protests. Our genocide is not your art. Execution is not art. This is disrespectful of our grandfathers. And this one that I really like. Take it down, take it down, take it down, take it down. Not your story, no respect, take it down. Shame on you. Not art, not a game, not your experience, not your story, not your family. And then there's this one. Native trauma is not art. I will not have my life narrowed down. I will not bow down to somebody else's whim or to somebody else's ignorance. Take it down. The Walker equals white supremacy. Take it down now. And then there's this one. Sam Durant and Scott Seekins. Maybe you've heard of Scott Seekins. He's an artist from Minnesota. He also does a lot of these kinds of things. But this sign says, as you can see, Sam Durant and Scott Seekins make money from Native narratives. Cultural genocide opportunists. Cultural genocide opportunists. Murder sites are not your playground. The signs just went up on the fences for, a lot. More and more signs and more people would show up. The world is watching. And then this one. The largest state-sanctioned mass execution is not art. And then look at this. Here's a little Dakota boy, a young boy, looking out at the scaffold. And can you imagine what he's thinking? And if he's your child, what would you say? Native Lives Matter, Dakota 38 +2. And then here's one. These are the names of the Dakota 38 that were hung in Mankato. And by +2, they include, there were 2 chiefs that escaped and went to Canada for protection. But the US Army sent men to Canada who found them, illegally arrested them in Canada and illegally brought them back here to the United States. And they were hung at Fort Snelling and buried, and no one even knows where they were buried. They were secretly buried somewhere at Fort Snelling. Now here it's finally being taken down, and they did it under ceremony. When they decided to take it down, they got together in ceremony and decided what to do. They dismantled it during ceremony, and it was secretly buried. Now just recall what we read that Sam Durant had previously written about white supremacy, and yet he never consults with any Dakota or Lakota people about his, quote, art project. He makes all this money on Dakota trauma. Can you see the invisibility of the people? Can you see the racism and the white supremacy? Okay. And then this is another piece by him. Now he sold this piece in England for 2,315 pounds. Again, taking Dakota or Indigenous trauma and making money from it. And Gracie goes on. The summer of 1862, Minnesota erupts in violence as desperate Dakota people attack white settlements along the Minnesota River. The Dakota were eventually overwhelmed by the US military 6 weeks later. The Dakota were more commonly referred to as the Sioux, which is a French word for snake in the grass. They ceded land through treaties for peace, food, and better living conditions. They lived on temporary reservations in southwestern Minnesota. For 2 decades, they were poorly treated by the federal government. Local traders and settlers and the Indian agents who were supposed to provide them with their reparations. They saw their hunting lands whittled down and provisions promised by the government rarely arrived. Worse yet, a wave of white settlers surrounded them. In connection with the Civil War, the US government enlisted white migrants by promising the American dream with owning their land to farm and settle. This was a problem as many settlers were given land that were previously agreed acres for the Dakota people. President Abraham Lincoln dispatched General John Pope, fresh from his defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Virginia, to organize the military department of the Northwest. Some Dakota fled to North Dakota, but more than 2,000 were rounded up, and over 300 warriors were sentenced to death. President Lincoln commuted most of their sentences, but on December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were executed at Mankato, Minnesota. During the trials in Mankato, surviving Dakota women, children, and elders were sent to Fort Snelling. This was a fort. This is Gracie's additions here. This was a fort located inside our sacred site called Badote. They lived in a concentration camp where women were routinely raped, killed, mutilated post-mortem by soldiers. Families retrieved bodies of victims and buried them secretly under their teepees so soldiers would not find the bodies. After the executions in Mankato, the surviving Dakota people stayed at Fort Snelling until they were sent in the spring of May 1863 to Crow Creek, South Dakota. Many died on the steamboats as they were packed inhumanely on boats and given little food. Dakota children and elders died on this board with no funerals or proper burials. When the boats reached Crow Creek, South Dakota, the Dakota people were given rancid cow meat. Half the population died, most of which were children. Gracie writes, "This is my story. These people were my family. On my maternal side, my grandfather, Louis LaBelle, was imprisoned for life in Sioux City, Iowa, after the Mankato hangings. On my paternal side, my grandfather was one of the Dakota 38, hanged. I do not know how I am existing, but I am here despite genocide." I urge you to find Native authors to read firsthand accounts of American history. Teach your children what you have learned. I also urge you to support Native artists. So that's what Gracie has for now. And I want to highlight some of what she said. I especially want to highlight what she said about the concentration camp and a little more about Fort Snelling in our history. It's important to know that land to build Fort Snelling was given in an 1805 treaty as the young US government wanted to control the rivers and the fur trade. The fur trade was large through the Wahpekute, who were canoe people, and also other Dakota bands and the French Canadian fur traders. And it was very beneficial to the US government, who benefited financially from the trading of furs, bringing furs, expensive furs into the US. And they liked that it was with the French Canadians, not the British. Fort Snelling was built to control the rivers and the fur trade. So in the beginning of its job, part of its job was to keep the settlers out of Minnesota. If settlers came here, the soldiers would tell them that they had to leave and afterwards would burn down the cabins. However, as time went on, the benefits of the fur trade changed and declined. And Colonel Sibley, the head of the US Army here, and Alexander Ramsey, who was the first mayor of St. Paul, realized that they could make a lot of money if they sold the land to white settlers, which they did, violating the treaties, violating their jobs in the US even. Plus, James J. Hill got the rights to build the railroad from St. Paul all the way to Oregon. The treaty gave him the land for the railroad bed, that's all. But he stole 35 miles on either side of the railroad bed. And he sent representatives to Germany, Scandinavia, and Ireland, where people were suffering economic decline, and said, cheap land, come to the upper Midwest and the west of the US, where you can have your own farm and the land is fertile. There are letters in the Minnesota Historical Society from Lincoln saying, cease and desist, you cannot sell land you do not own. But Lincoln was busy fighting the Civil War, and Hill sold land all the way west, making millions, and also in the capitalist tradition of building a market for his railroad. And then he built that huge mansion in St. Paul, which you may have seen, the James J. Hill House. Interesting story about that too. So settlers landed here. Sibley and Ramsey became wealthy. Researcher Gary G. Coles shows that Ramsey had made a fortune in real estate because of his dealings selling property to white settlers and businessmen after he himself had negotiated the US Dakota treaties. But those treaties cheated the tribes out of their land. So to allow the settlers, Sibley and Ramsey forced the Wahpekute and other Dakota people westward to a narrow, only 10-mile wide reservation, which, as Gracie mentioned, along the Minnesota River, telling them basically, sign or we will force you out through weapons or war. There was not enough land there for them to find enough food, and they could not leave the reservations to hunt buffalo, which they were used to doing. Supposedly, the US government was going to pay them annuities and provide food and supplies, but most of the money was kept by the Indian agents, the white Indian agents, and it was given to white leaders and business people seditiously, and the supplies often sold to white Scandinavian, Irish, and German settlers. What buffalo was left, settlers were encouraged to hunt and kill them to get rid of the buffalo, which was the food supply for the indigenous people. And people were encouraged to hunt and remove them so that the indigenous people would be forced to move further west. So take a look at this photo of this pile of buffalo bones. And of course, you've probably read about this, how some men would travel in a train and shoot buffalo out the windows of the train. And they wouldn't take them for food. They would just leave them to die in the prairies. And they were encouraged to do that so that the people would have to move further west. And the result of all of this was the outbreak when the Dakota people came to the Indian agents to get what they were entitled to. and the refusal meant the outbreak of the US Dakota War of 1862. So now I'm going to show you this. This is the hanging in Mankato on December 26th. And I want to quote from Civil War Major General John Pope, whom Gracie referred to, in a letter to the first governor of the territory of Minnesota, who was Colonel Henry Sibley, dated September 28th, 1862, while Sibley was leading US soldiers against the Dakota. Here's a letter from Major General John Pope, whom Lincoln had established as the major leader here. Quote, "Destroy everything belonging to them," he says to Sibley, "and force them out to the plains, unless, as I suggest, you can capture them. They are to be treated as maniacs or wild beasts, and by no means as people with whom treaties or compromises can be made," unquote. Shortly after that, Ramsey becomes the first governor of the state of Minnesota. And he states during the war, quote, "The Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state," unquote. And here's a quote from his Thanksgiving Day proclamation when the war was just over. Quote, "Especially let us recognize God's mercy in that he has delivered our borders from the savage enemies who rose up against us, and cast them into the pit they had privily dug for us, that our friends have been rescued from the horrors of captivity, and that our homes and household treasures are now safe from the violence of Indian robbers and assassins." Let's just let that sink in. As a result of the war, all of the captured fighting men, over 300, were incarcerated, as Gracie tells us. I want you to know, this is from me, I want you to know that one Army colonel actually wrote in a letter, quote, "We must create a concentration camp at Fort Snelling," actually using those words. I've seen it in print. We think that was Hitler's idea, but Isabel Wilkerson, in her book about racism in the US called Caste, researched and found that Hitler sent men to the US to study US policy toward Black people and Indigenous people. And she tells us that he based his policies toward the Jews on US policies here toward Black and Indigenous people. And she also tells us that his policies that he chose were milder than what was here in the US. So more than 2,000 men, women, children, and elders were forced marched all the way from the reservation in western Minnesota on the Minnesota River, 330 miles to Fort Snelling, and they were incarcerated there in a concentration camp. It was called a concentration camp on a small acreage where hundreds died from illness and starvation. Sibley and Ramsey would later be responsible for this largest mass execution in the history of the US, the hanging of the Dakota 38 in Mankato on the day after Christmas, 1862. And can you imagine that 2,000 white people would show up on that day to watch the hanging of the Dakota 38? They originally tried and found guilty in 5-minute trials, no lawyers, all of the 300 fighting men. But Lincoln said he would only sign for those who could be proven to have killed or raped. But Ramsey and Sibley said that won't fly here because they could only prove 2 had killed or raped. And Lincoln wanted Minnesota to become part of the Union in order to pass the Emancipation Proclamation. So finally, Lincoln signed for the 38. I want to encourage all of you, if it happens this year, to go to Mankato on the day after Christmas to the honoring of the Dakota 38 plus 2. That happens every year in Mankato. It didn't happen last year because there was a very small group because of the pandemic, and they didn't invite the public. but it has been happening for a long time, deciding whether it will happen this year or not. It's a beautiful honoring as we greet the riders who have ridden by horseback all the way across southern Minnesota, 330 miles from South Dakota, representing the return of the people. You know, I have heard there's still a law in the books in Minnesota that says that Dakota people, it's illegal for them to live here. It hasn't ever been taken off the books. It's not enforced, obviously, but it's still there. So this represents the return of the people. And I want to tell you a little bit of the history of this. In 2005, a Dakota Lakota Vietnam vet named Jim Miller kept having a recurring dream that he thought was a nightmare. He knew nothing about the hanging. It wasn't in his history lessons, and he didn't know about it, but he kept seeing men being hung in his dream. And he saw himself and others riding east across the prairies on horseback. Finally, he went to a medicine man and told him the dream. And the medicine man said, I know exactly what you're dreaming. You're having a vision of the Dakota 38, and you have to fulfill that vision. So Jim organized a ride, and it's been happening for 15 years, including runners who run from Fort Snelling to Mankato. And now it also includes walkers who walk to protect the water protectors. They don't walk all 330 miles from South Dakota, but they walk what they can, and then they get into a car and other walkers take over for them, and that goes on. And also many people across communities across southern Minnesota host the ride. They provide them a place to eat, and they feed them, and they give the horses a place to be. And Gracie did the ride in high school all the time. And after that, and now her 10-year-old son walks with others. So we get to greet them all. They've been riding across all of December. We get to greet them as they come into the memorial site in Mankato. There's a memorial site, and we get to listen to the beautiful ceremony that happens, usually led by important medicine people, medicine men or medicine leaders, and also the talks. And 2 years ago, Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan was there to give a talk, but at the last minute, Governor Walz showed up and he apologized. And after the ceremony, there's a lovely gathering nearby inside with food, and there's hoop dancers and art exhibits and teachings. It's very worthwhile to go to. So if they have it this year, it's still unknown, but if you can, it'd be great to go. And there's also an honoring, which Gracie has been bringing forward at Mankato, to honor the 200 women and children who died at Fort Snelling, which she talked about in her PowerPoint. And lately, she's been bringing another thing forward at Mankato. In the last couple of years, they've been bringing forward the over 5,700 missing or murdered women over the last several years. This is another sign of invisible racism. Just read what this says. Invisible no more, the 5,712 Native women were reported murdered or missing in 2016. Now we've lost count. And you see that red hand over the mouth. That's to remember the missing and murdered women. This is another sign of invisible racism. Remember the news over the last period of time about Gabby Petito, the white woman who had gone missing while on a trip with her boyfriend? All over the news feeds, and still is, one white woman, but we hear nothing of the more than 5,000, more than 6,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I want to show you another photo. This has been happening especially around reservations near the pipeline and oil industries in North and South Dakota, Nebraska, and Montana. Typically, about 1,000 pipeline construction workers are living in man camps. Sexual assaults in the Bakken oil region in North Dakota increased by 75%. That's a big deal. There are studies done around the country that show that assaults of Indigenous women are the least recognized and the least protected, and that 97% of Native victims are abused by someone who is not Native. And there are legal loopholes. Tribes cannot prosecute non-Native people. So let's take all of that in. Okay, so a word about boarding schools. You've heard and read about the bodies of children found buried in piles in Canadian boarding schools and the of that all over Canada. Well, we had boarding schools all over this country. And here in Minnesota, buses would travel to Western Wisconsin, picking up children as young as 6, taking them out of their families, then drive all over Minnesota, which of course would take all day, picking up children all over Minnesota, and finally drive them all the way into boarding schools in South Dakota. Can you imagine children just going through that long, likely overnight bus trip by themselves and leaving their families for 9 months? And then in the boarding schools, they were not allowed to wear their own clothing. Their hair was cut. They couldn't speak their own languages, even if they did not know English. And it is well known that they were terribly physically abused and even sexually abused. The intention in writing by US government officials, this is in writing, it was to address the quote, Indian problem. Native children should be civilized and education would be the appropriate vehicle to enact assimilationist policies on Native American people to eliminate the cultural identity, unquote. Luckily, the Secretary of the Interior, you may have heard, Deb Haaland, is very interested in investigating all of this in the US, and she has set up a process for that. Senators have introduced a bill making September 30th, just like in Canada now, a day to be observed as National Day of Remembrance for children who died in boarding schools. And Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts and others have a bill to create a Truth and Healing Commission on the Indigenous boarding school policies in the US. So there is movement about all of this happening in the US that matches what has been happening in Canada. However, most of the boarding schools in the US were run by churches. They divided up the areas. The Catholics got this area, the Methodists got this one, the Episcopals got this area, the Lutherans had this one, and so on. And of course, those religious organizations are concerned about their financial liabilities. So if you are in favor of these things happening and of an investigation going on here, let your Congress people know that's something that you can do. You can take that action. Louise Erdrich, Indigenous writer and artist who taught a year at Carleton here and then started the Birch Bark bookstore in Minneapolis. She holds art exhibits at the store occasionally. A few years ago, she had one which included a few art pieces by surviving boarding school adults. And what I'm going to say now is probably going to be really shocking. And I'm sorry that you have to hear this, but I also think it's important that we know this too, that we witness this in our history. A shocking one that I saw in her exhibit showed children on the school grounds, a few nuns near them, but then a line of young boys, likely for punishment. And this line of young boys, in front of them is a priest with his pants down, and the boys obviously expected to service him. Shocking to see that. Now, just let that kind of sink in, but let's hope that there is an investigation in the US of what actually happened in these boarding schools. I want to say something about appropriations. Many people for a long time have thought it was okay to appropriate Native ceremonies and spiritual practices, like even sweat lodges, thinking it was okay to lead ceremonies Also using sage and other ceremonial objects, smoking the pipe and sharing it with others. Though no one would ever think that you could lead a Christian or Jewish religious ceremony without training, without going to seminary or having serious approval and permission, we wouldn't think that was okay to just do. But many have thought that it was okay to appropriate indigenous spiritual ceremonies, practices, and objects. The Lakota used to be very open about their spiritual ceremonies, included others easily, but now they found they have to be much more cautious because of how easily white folks can appropriate. Again, invisible racism, as it is something we would not do in a white spiritual organization or church. In California, sage is disappearing because it is so purchased by so many companies and by so many people. Although it is a sacred herb for indigenous people, they use it in ceremony. They say it's disappearing because it's picked so widely and picked improperly, not in ways that allow it to grow back. We have sage here, but I have not seen much in a very long time. So if you ever pick sage, just pick the top so it can keep growing. And also think about, it as a ceremonial and important object. Perhaps you saw in the paper recently, Minnetonka Moccasins has made a ton of money on its native style moccasins, and they have apologized, and they have also hired a native woman, an indigenous woman, to be a guide for them about what's appropriate and what isn't. So I want to say something about the burial mounds in St. Paul. And again, this is important to know about. Maybe you have heard about Pilot Knob Hill in St. Paul. There's Pilot Knob Road, and at the end of the road is a very high hill overlooking the Mississippi River near Fort Snelling, where Dakota people buried their dead. So there are many large burial mounds at the top of Pilot Knob Hill, at the very top. In 1920, and part of the reason why it's so high is because of these burial mounds that happened there. In 1920, the city of St. Paul took huge amounts of dirt off the mounds to build roads. The workers found many bones and just threw them into a shop. Again, shocking. Would that ever happen in a white cemetery where someone would dig it up? Would that ever be allowed? On the west side of these mounds now, there is a cemetery, originally a Masonic cemetery, but now called Acacia Cemetery. And no one knows if this land was part of the Dakota burial mounds and was just taken over to be a largely white cemetery built right on top, with gravestones on top of the burial mounds. They don't know. Then a few years ago, Xcel Energy built power lines up there, up to the top, and someone built a road because developers wanted to build 2 large, expensive condominiums up high to have a great view of the river. So right now, what it looks like is these beautiful prairie grass mounds. On the one side, this road in the middle, this power line, and then over on the other side is the Acacia Cemetery. And they wanted to put 2 large, expensive condominiums right on top of the burial mounds. The Dakota people objected, but weren't able to get anywhere. It almost happened. The condominiums were going to be built on top of the burial mounds, until a group of women from a Jewish synagogue in the cities joined the fight and convinced the city of St. Paul not to allow it, as we would never allow that to happen on a white people's cemetery. Again, another example of the recent invisible racism toward Indigenous people. And also really sad that the objections of the Dakota people weren't listened to. It took the help of the Jewish activists, which is great. But again, do you see the invisibility of the people and the invisible racism? The Dakota people not being listened to, not mattering. So another example, in recent times, this is very recent. So I know that all of this is a lot to share and to know. And I hope you take it all in, and I hope it inspires you for whatever action that you see you can take. And we can take some time for questions now, but first I'd like you to look around and see people you know here. I'd like to ask you to find someone you can get together with later, either later tonight or tomorrow, the next few days. This is really a lot to take in, and it is hard and painful stuff. And what I'd like to ask is that you get together with someone and share how it makes you feel. How do you feel hearing all of this? Go beyond the intellectual stuff and share together how you feel. Not that you shouldn't talk about the intellectual material, the facts, or the history. That's important too. But allowing yourself to sense and share with someone how you feel. Because remember, collective witnessing and presencing is part of the healing. And we can be the ones who become the remedy to heal this legacy. So I hope you will find whatever action you can take, and that you will share with other people. And I'd like to thank I thank you all for being here. First of all, thank you. And also I'd like to thank the library and also Tyler for helping this to happen. And it will be posted on the library website if you want to listen again, or you want to encourage other people to listen. Okay, time for questions.